So we got some breaking news out of New York, which really came as a surprise to me and I think many others, which is that Donald Trump has been criminally indicted in regards to the trial involving the Stormy Daniels hush money, which really started during the 2016 campaign, or at least the beginning of this story. And then, of course, Alvin Bragg, the DA of Manhattan, has really been pursuing this case ever since he assumed that position. So this took many people by surprise. I certainly didn't see this coming, at least now. You know, this was something that might have come later down the road, but many people didn't expect it to happen as soon as it did. So we're going to talk about what this means for Donald Trump, what this means for the Republican primary, the other Republican contenders or potential contenders such as Ron DeSantis, and what this means for the general election in November of 2024. So as always, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the actual indictment and the proceedings and whatnot, because I'm not a lawyer. I really don't know all the legalese that comes with that. But essentially the indictment is the first part of the criminal process. So this basically formally gives Donald Trump the charges that Alvin Bragg is dishing out to him. And effectively, that comes out to a misdemeanor. But, you know, it's a way to sort of get Donald Trump criminally indicted. This is something, obviously, Democrats and prosecutors have wanted to do for a very long time. So now that it's actually happened, you know, it's sort of a surreal moment, because for many years, many people thought that Donald Trump was finished, you know, just around the corner, that these indictments, that various other scandals, Russiagate, the impeachments were going to stop him, and that ultimately didn't materialize. But, you know, in some ways, this does feel a bit different given the circumstances that have happened after the 2020 election. And, you know, there's other criminal charges being looked at by the DA of Fulton County regarding January 6th and other things. So, you know, this might be just the first indictment that Donald Trump actually gets. But again, I'm not going to talk about all the various cases and what merit there is to them or not. I'm just going to talk about how I think this impacts the 2024 presidential election. So, of course, we'll start off with the primary. Now, Ron DeSantis, who is seen as Donald Trump's main rival in the Republican primary, and I think rightfully so, given the fact that I think if any Republican was going to beat Donald Trump in a primary, it would be Ron DeSantis. He put out a statement shortly after the indictment happened. He said the weaponization of the legal system to advance a political agenda turns the rule of law on its head. It's un-American. The Soros-backed Manhattan District Attorney has consistently bent the law to downgrade felonies and to excuse criminal misconduct. Yet now, he is stretching the law to target a political opponent. Florida will not assist in the extradition request given the questionable circumstances at issue with this Soros-backed Manhattan prosecutor and his political agenda. So, you know, DeSantis, in my opinion, from a Republican primary point of view, gave a very good statement, because the vast majority of Republican primary voters massively disapprove of the Trump indictment. They don't want to see Trump indicted. They see this as a political witch hunt. And I think DeSantis' statement was very wise, considering the fact that there are some voters in the MAGA orbit that are very wary of Ron DeSantis and sort of try to paint him as this establishment anti-Trump figure. And I think this statement is a smart way in the Republican primary of DeSantis positioning himself as that conservative who sticks to principle despite the attacks that Donald Trump has levied at him throughout the entire primary process. Now, if we take a look at some of the opinion polls for the Republican primary, and again, I want to stress, as I have on my Twitter account, that polling this early on really doesn't mean a whole lot. It's extremely volatile, and we're literally almost a year away, less than a year away, from actual voting. So there's still many months to go in this primary process before any votes are cast. But as of right now, Donald Trump in the aggregate has a 15.9, basically a 16-point lead over Ron DeSantis, who's his next runner-up. So obviously Trump's at 44%, DeSantis at 29%, Haley at 5%. Mike Pence, interestingly enough, is actually beating Haley currently at 6.2%. And other or undecideds at about 14.5%. So one notable thing about this right away is that Trump is at under 50% in the aggregate and in most of the polls that have been conducted. Now, I will say that in recent months, since February, Trump has led consistently in every Republican primary poll, and he's led pretty convincingly as well. You really have to go back all the way to shortly after the midterm elections back in 2022 to where you really see a decently competitive primary where Ron DeSantis was very much in striking distance. Now, again, I want to stress that polls really don't matter a whole lot this early on, but Donald Trump is still the favorite as of right now to win the Republican nomination. And he always was. I think everybody knew going into this that Trump was the favorite. He's literally the former incumbent. Many still see him as a standard bearer of the Republican Party. So knocking him off, dethroning him, so to speak, was always going to be a massive challenge. And it's why I still have him as the favorite to win the nomination. Now, the indictment does throw sort of a wrench in things because I think there's two ways this could play out. This could either help Donald Trump in a primary or it could hurt Donald Trump in a primary. Now, there's potentially a third option as well, and that's that Donald Trump gets a bump after the indictment for a little while, and that bump sort of simmers down, similarly to how Trump took a massive hit after the midterm elections, and he sort of bounced back. That's why I say this polling is really so volatile, because so much can change in just a short period of time. Again, back in November and December, we were talking about Trump slipping in the polls, potentially not even making it to Iowa, and now we're at a point where Trump is at a pretty commanding lead. So, again, DeSantis may fall off in the polls for a while, and for some DeSantis supporters, it's frustrating because DeSantis isn't actually in the race yet. So you could argue, well, DeSantis is polling this well, not being in the race, that's actually a good thing. But also, this is sort of how people are gauging the DeSantis candidacy before it even happens. And potentially, DeSantis is looking at these numbers before he even runs in to make a final decision to decide whether or not he really wants to throw his hat in the ring or not. Now, I think ultimately DeSantis will announce a run. I think it'll probably happen sometime between May and June. That's pretty much at the end of the Florida legislative session. And, this was something most people expected anyway. It would be a pretty bad look on DeSantis's part if he just won re-election and then right after announces a run for president. Now, you could argue that him announcing in May or June is really right after his second term, but DeSantis sees this as his window for the presidency, and I think rightfully so. If DeSantis doesn't run now and he waits till 2028, he risks becoming irrelevant like Chris Christie. Now, Chris Christie, of course, ran for president while he was still governor, but he took a massive hit in popularity because of it and ultimately faded into obscurity, although he's still sort of active in GOP circles, sort of in the more anti-Trump camp now, especially after 2020 and January 6th and all of that. But many thought that Chris Christie's window was during the 2012 election. He was a popular governor in a blue state. Obviously, he won re-election by a commanding margin a year later. He had a really good response to Hurricane Sandy. So he was seen as an incredibly strong candidate. And, even back in 2013, 2014, many Republicans were talking about Chris Christie as the potential nominee in 2016. Now, ultimately, that never materialized. Obviously, if Christie was running in 2012, he already would have been on the campaign trail when Sandy happened. That actually could have given him a giant hit in the campaign because he was on the trail. But regardless, it's a tale of a candidate missing their window. And I think DeSantis running now is probably his only bet, because if he waits until 2028, lets Trump be the nominee, whatever happens in the general. Trump can't, if he did somehow win the general election, he can't run for a third term. So it would be an open primary either way in that scenario. But DeSantis risks being overshadowed by some other Republican that perhaps we've never even heard of before. I mean, DeSantis was relatively unknown until 2018. So, newcomers in politics are always a thing. We're always going to have surprises. Nobody really knew who Glenn Youngkin was back in 2020. And now he's the governor of Virginia and probably one of the most popular Republicans in the country. But looking at the primary dynamic this time around, I personally think that Trump will benefit in the primary from this indictment. Probably temporarily. I don't think it's going to be a long-term benefit. Again, it really does depend how DeSantis and Trump himself play their cards, how this indictment ultimately pans out. But Trump has a solid base of support in the GOP. He has that 30 to 40% of voters completely locked down that are almost unwavering in their support of him. So that really leaves the rest of the voters, I think a majority, but it's a small majority of Republican voters, sort of open-minded and up for grabs. And again, Donald Trump's diehard circle, I think, has been shrinking over time, but he still has a pretty large floor, and I think that's something that's going to really help him in a primary, especially if you have a lot of candidates running, because all they have to do is split the vote, and Donald Trump wins the nomination again. That's exactly what happened in 2016. Funny enough, Donald Trump got about 44% of the vote in the 2016 primary. He didn't even get a majority. A majority of Republicans chose someone other than Donald Trump, but because the field was so split, he ended up becoming the Republican nominee. And this time around, Republicans risk making that mistake again if they really are serious about stopping Donald Trump from getting the nomination. Now, going into the general election, I think if Trump somehow is the nominee for the Republicans and he goes up against Joe Biden, I think he's at a massive disadvantage, especially with this indictment. Many people in Trump world and Republican circles think that an indictment is going to help a presidential candidate. You know, if you kind of get outside that bubble, it certainly doesn't. Nobody wants to see somebody that's criminally indicted running for president. That's almost certainly going to hurt him. Trump could try and spin it any way he wants, but in a general election, that's going to be a massive liability for him. So, if anything, this makes Joe Biden's reelection a bit more certain tonight if Donald Trump ends up becoming the nominee, because while his base might be fired up and sort of have this persecution complex around Donald Trump, I don't think it's going to play nationally to independents and certainly Democratic voters. But those independent voters really need to win that already disapprove of Donald Trump by wide margins, and they disapprove of Biden too. But when you pit the two against each other and Biden is the incumbent, I think Biden wins that pretty handily. So anyway, it is still the night of the indictment. There's a lot of developments. There's going to be a lot of bad takes online, and certainly heated opinions, I think many of which that are going to be very rushed and not well thought out. But certainly as time goes on, as things simmer down, we'll sort of get a better picture of how this indictment is actually going to impact the 2024 election. These are, of course, just my preliminary thoughts, just hours after we actually got the indictment. So we'll be back to regularly scheduled videos. I was sick for a bit. I was away for a bit, but I'm eager to get back in and talk about a lot of the political news that has been going on lately. So anyway, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed, leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.